Hi, and welcome to this episode of Brain Music and Learning. My name is Minna Huotilainen, and I think that we as neuroscientists need to listen to the people in the arts in order not to instrumentalize music and the other arts. It was amazing to visit Dr. Fiona Phillips and Dr. Merinda Kelly in Melbourne at Deakin University and discuss the universal and holistic meaning of the arts for children.
Dr. Fiona Phillips, and I'm from the Warm Ponds campus in Geelong.
My name's Merinda Kelly, Dr. Merinda Kelly, and I work at the Burwood campus on which we're on now.
Wonderful to have you as guests in our podcast because I think you have something to say to our teachers. And we are now talking about both music but also visual arts today.
That's correct, yes.
And where we intersect with our practice is through the media arts, which is another art form that is in the mandatory curriculum for the Australian curriculum.
Oh, that's interesting. Yes. Yeah. Has it been for a long time?
Ever since the Australian curriculum was written, the 5 art forms were all included. So media, music, visual arts, dance and drama were all included in the Australian curriculum.
Yeah.
And the Victorian curriculum also, obviously the artwork in our states, the Victorian curriculum has those same 5 art forms.
Yeah.
But the Victorian curriculum also adds design in, visual design. But one of the things about it is that with the Australian curriculum now, it has the overarching learning area of the arts. Mm-hmm. So those art forms sit under it.
Oh, yeah. As a Finnish person, when I listen to that list, what is missing from my point of view is crafts. But that probably belongs to the visual arts part.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, right. I think it also feeds into media arts as well because, there's a lot of the crafting. We do a lot of that sort of hands-on work.
Yeah.
But we actually also then mediate that work through a media lens so that students are getting a digital trace of the work, not only the process, but also media products and communication tools. They're learning about how to communicate their learning. Digitally really effectively, but they've got the visual literacy skills and the arts literacy skills to do so really effectively because they understand how to create for a specific audience or how to create, communicate their own ideas and meanings, not just someone else's.
And there's also an intersection too with the crafts around the craftsmanship of the instrument itself. So that's something that crosses across into sort of the historical narrative, even in around our First Nations people, and looking at what they used as instruments and breaking down some of those really traditional musics that have actually come from European cultures and looking at instruments more broadly. So when you look at the intersection between what makes a sound, what actually vibrates, how do we design something that's going to carry that sound further? So those intersections between, sort of crafting an instrument and the old-fashioned craft of really, how much goes into making and working with wood or working with strings or working with just the things with the brass instruments, for example, and they've all been traditionally, but we're seeing also design elements come into that whole thing. There was a movement throughout Victoria for a little while with a guy whose name was John Madden, and he basically took very Indigenous instruments from Zimbabwe and brought them back to Australia in the form of the marimba, and you find them everywhere, dotted up throughout the eastern seaboard coast because they were gross motor.
Yeah.
And they were, because of that gross motor, instead of being fine motor or fine motor, they allowed children to really access it quite easily. And so he worked on that, and you could really do a lot of that musicking, where children were involved with each other, and they actually are quite a craft. There's a design and a craft in actually crafting those instruments, and he brought that in and help children really access that design element of making their own instruments, making their own sounds, and that expressive element.
And there's also that intersection with visual arts, because the visual arts these days encompasses so much more than what is the visual. Mm-hmm. So we're going beyond, it's much more sensorial.
Yes.
So it's not just about the visual, so we leverage the synergies across our practices because we understand that we have a whole ecology of practice. Mm-hmm. And we learn, we'd just like to acknowledge the first pedagogues, yes. the first artists, the first scientists, our Australian Indigenous people, our Australian Torres Strait Islanders. We have lots of artwork around because we acknowledge that in our practice always. We always acknowledge them in our classes, and through our practices we always elevate their work because of the materiality, and we can learn a lot about. And now we work in a very material way, and that's, we sort of leverage that learning into cultural learning that Fiona was talking about. The arts are so well placed for students to learn about different cultures, but in ways that are hands-on. So they're really getting more empathy and understanding of how amazing these cultures were, because they're actually engaging in similar practices, not appropriating or not copying, but they're using similar processes, and they can understand the craftsmanship,
yes,
and the beauty and the sound and the visuality and all of those elements. They develop a much more of a deeper understanding of the culture. Yeah. And I think it's really sad to see that a lot of that hands-on learning isn't occurring. Mm-hmm. It's being replaced by wellbeing programs and places, things like that, particularly in primary schools, where children are just doing what we call activities, sort of busy work. It might be a craft activity and it might make you feel temporarily good. But we ask, where's the learning? Where's the actual transparent learning and how are children articulating that? Or are they just saying, I feel good?
Yeah. This is the most difficult part for me as a neuroscientist, because I'm one of those people who has been highlighting the well-being effects of different types of arts, especially music, but also crafts and also physical activities. And that's the problem, because the well-being effects, they are there, and that's wonderful that they are there. And of course, we want to do research on these effects and we want to highlight those effects, but that's not why art is done. And that's the difficult part, because neuroscience has very big problems in grasping the essence of art. And I'm the first person to say that let's not even try, because the tool is the wrong tool.
That's right.
Yeah. So then how to keep a balance between these two? How to promote the well-being effects and say that, hey, our school cannot be only pupils sitting down on chairs and somebody speaking to them for several hours per day. We have to acknowledge that these pupils are people with bodies, and they want to do things, and they want to use their hands and their eyes and their ears and do everything. That's and be active in the world of different types of arts. But then at the same time, that's not the reason for why arts are there.
It's very interesting, because that message of the neuroscience is actually very powerful as an introduction to the purpose. What has been missing from some of our conversations across advocating for the arts has been that we've known that they're good at this, or they're good at that. But when we brought them to principals, or we brought those messages to the wider society, it was more about purpose. They valued the arts. There's no doubt about that, because that showed in their feet, going to see things or going to see galleries, or, but they were, taking a step back from there was not the same sense of embodiment. But when you take some of those messages from neuroscience to the principals who are desperately trying to change or address some of their focus points in their school improvement plans, what I found in my research was that was very useful to have those arguments, but that you had to take the teachers beyond that. Mm-hmm. You couldn't instrumentalise music as being, you have to do it in your classroom, or it's good to do it in your classroom because at first you're doing music because it's part of being human. because we all have a voice and a body. We all want to express ourselves and communicate with other people. And we have to allow children to have time to do that and to learn how to express themselves and how to communicate. So in my PhD research, that's what we started at. But we underpinned that with the fact that it also does this for the brain, so you will notice. And it was a very interesting time because the principal, first off in my research, was not convinced that it would do even some of the wellbeing benefits. It was only because he participated in it himself. So there was this one lovely example where they were learning those bigger instruments I was talking about, marimbas, and we'd introduced them into the school because of their gross motor and because they connected with some of the cultural background of some of the students in that school. And I taught one of the classroom teachers just very small patterns, sequencing those patterns, layering those patterns, so there's lots of mathematics going on. And the principal had been watching the children learn, and he'd come in and had a bit of a learn himself to see what it was like to, undertake this activity. And so they were showing to the parents, they were sharing with the parents, and this is one of the other things that we tried to break down, was to have participatory experiences where the children were sharing more often and that they weren't really presenting to someone. Yeah. They were just sharing in a circle. So the circle, which Merinda might talk about a bit later, the circle became very important as part of that process of sharing. And so they were doing one of these sessions when they were all in the circle, and this young little boy in the session, he lost his way in the music. And the principal stepped in and picked up the mallets and showed him how to play it. And then, of course, he completely lost himself. Once he remembered the pattern, he just couldn't stop playing it. Oh, yeah. He was, he's got his part. And the beauty of that too is that some students were able to say, can we do it this way? So they were able to have a sense of agency, lifting that part. But the principal, because the principal participated in that experience for himself, he suddenly understood how important participatory experiences were, how important that aspect of, the patterns write so easily on our brain. It's easy to chunk them. So making something that was very easy for both the classroom teacher and the students to play gave them a sense to be able to springboard off into creativity. Because when you have that confidence, you take more of a risk. So they became risk takers as well. And he, in a sense, took a risk, stepping into that circle and from his position to be alongside the students. But he said how impactful it was on his whole understanding of the purpose of music, and his whole understanding of how powerful it could be in his own life. He hadn't realised that before because he'd never been part of a participatory experience of music in that way. Yeah.
And I suppose, segueing from that aha moment that principal had, I found I came to academia, or back to academia. I'd left academia. I've been an artist all my life and an arts educator. And I've also worked in galleries and museums for a long time as well as schools. I was I came out of a K-12 directorship. I ran our arts, technology and design campus for senior secondary students, but I was also in charge of all the learning K-12 and in arts, design and technology, but I was also a leader in the field of learning the gifted and talented program. And what I learned in schools was that it wasn't the children I had to educate. It was really my principal, my deputies, my colleagues, the parents and carers, the broader public, the grandparents, because I found that they were the ones that had a model in their head about what arts education was, but they didn't really understand the affordances of arts education, and they always tended to think of arts education as vocational. You only do that if you want to be a musician or an artist. Yeah. And so what I found was running that campus and also running that program, over 2,000 students in across several campuses in this school. And what I started to do was think, how can I communicate that to a broader audience? How can I promote and advocate for the arts in schools? And so, while I was already hooked into a lot of professional organisations at the time, it wasn't them that needed convincing. It was actually that cohort I just spoke about. So what I tried to do was find opportunities where that could be communicated. So I developed a range of posters that were around the school, pamphlets that children could take home about the arts. So included in each pamphlet was sort of why the arts learning is important. Also, where does it go in the school? So mapping where they can learn it, the affordances of it, beyond employment, but then where they could go in senior school towards, where they could go and what university pathways there might be. And I found parents would ring me up and start talking about that and saying, this is their heart subject, but I'm trying to make them do STEAM. And they don't want to do STEAM. They want to do art, or music or whatever. So I found that was a really useful tool. But the other thing that I did was create a K-12 arts, technology and design show at the campus, on my campus that I ran. It was a major headache getting that ready to represent over 2,000 works of art, design and technology. And that includes systems, technology, textiles, wooden, hard materials, visual art, media, visual communication and design, all the areas, right from, kinder, right through to, or early learning, right through to year 12. And that brought massive audiences. We ran it over 4 days. And we also had educational didactic panels that made transparent the learning. And that was the best pedagogical tool to use to actually educate the broader public. And then our numbers grew exponentially, and our programs grew out of that. So I would always say to teachers, you aren't just educating children here. And I think that would be my message. And taking that, this is what Fiona and I, both of us, having been in the classroom, we understand that, and we both agree that it's not just about the teaching through what they get through the arts. It's about the learning that they get in the art form itself, in the disciplinary areas, that rich, embodied learning, the sensoriality of it. They become more attuned to nature, their environment, the potentiality of materials and what materials can do. And they'll have a much more creative life. And I'd say to my youth students, I don't care if you don't be an artist, you'll have a much more creative life because now you've got a creative mindset, which is open to possibility. And the aha moment that I had, my favourite aha moment, was teaching a gifted and talented program with disengaged, very highly intelligent students. And I used the arts. And the parents, there was a big pushback because these parents were really pushing their children because they were high achievers, but they were disengaged. So I made a giant brain.
A visual
brain, a giant brain, and I made a game where it was, all the lobes and all the parts of the brain and what they did and all that sort of thing. We made chocolate brains with marshmallows, and we made brains out of plasticine. We made neurons. We did all these.
We listened to what brains might sound like.
Yeah,
what's going on.
There's all these different things that we did around brains. I took them to museums, and all this sort of stuff. And then I showed them a slide that had a brain on an exercise bike. And I said, I can't teach you anything. I said, it's up to you. If you want to learn something, it's up to you. I can only create the situation that's conducive to learning. And if you want to get on that exercise bike
and work your brain
and change your brain, create new neural pathways and really challenge your brain. But I can't put you on the bike. I can only create the situation. And then they were allowed to, it was an inquiry program, they could go any trajectory they wanted to, learning trajectory. It was beyond the curriculum, it was anything they wanted. And these students were from year 5 to 9. And we treated it like a mini PhD, we sort of use that model. And then they had to write their own report. about their own learning. So they had to think really, we talked about metacognition right throughout, and they learned, you know, and we had a diary room where they went in and recorded, had prompts on the questions like Big Brother. And, you know, we had questions on the wall and they had to answer those, and they had to make a video and present it to all their parents and everybody. And they had to do a presentation about what they'd learned. And it really hit me when this really disengaged child said, you know, I never realised I was learning for myself. I've always learned to try and make my parents happy, my grandparents happy, you know, my teacher happy, keep everyone happy, but I don't really care about the learning. But he said, I get it now. I'm learning for me.
Wow. It was a very amazing aha moment.
Thank you. Thank you for participating in this. It's wonderful to talk to you.